Let's start with Timothy Searchinger. He is the first one. He is American with some ancestors in Latvia. He has two jobs. He is senior scholar at Princeton, and he is technical director of the World Resources Institute. He publishes in Science and in Nature. You may know his report for the United Nations, the World Bank, and the World Resources Institute called Creating a Sustainable Food Future. He is ecologist, he is economist, he is agronomist, he is public policy advisor, and possibly he is not completely convinced of the success of future carbon sequestration. I give you the floor.
Let's see, let me try talking into this. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, with my my great grandparents, where they came from. And yeah, I have the pleasure of working on global studies. Basically, how do you feed the world without destroying the world? As I was mentioning to someone last night, the benefit of, is there a problem? Oh, I'm sorry. The benefit of that is that I do global models and no one can really tell me I'm wrong. Now, you guys, you have to do immediate soil carbon, you have the challenges there. So should take everything I say with the resulting grain of salt. But what I want to communicate to you is where I think the real opportunities are with soil carbon. I think they're more limited than people have talked about, but also where we can make mistakes if we pursue it in the wrong way and where we need to go. So let's see, this is, oh, I turned on. So let's start with the single biggest problem from agriculture, which is it uses half of the world's vegetated land. And it's responsible, as you all know, for about a quarter of all the carbon in the atmosphere today was put there because of agricultural conversion. And you've all seen this, we all know it's responsible for overall between ongoing land use change and production emissions, about a quarter of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. This is from that report, Creating a Sustainable Food Future. You can argue about the details, but that's basically, you know, more or less agreed. Land use change, of course, comes from agricultural expansion. This is the Amazon. Basically, it's particularly expanding in the tropics. It's contracting in Europe and the US, but not because we're so great. It's contracting because we cleared so much land in the past. As I was saying to somebody last night, one reason it's contracting is simply we got rid of horses. Horses used to use 20 million hectares of land just for oats in the United States, probably another 40 million hectares of pasture. This is as late as the 1930s. They grazed forests. When we got rid of horses, we freed up a huge amount of land. Also, Europe has been outsourcing its food supply, we're going to talk about. And in addition to that, it reached peak meat. So other parts of the world aren't, they're expanding. And basically, more or less, anyone who models this projects something like a 50% food gap between the food we're going to need in 2050, and typically people are using numbers like 2010. So we already cleared half of the world's vegetated land. We need 50% more food. Now, we modeled this, and so today, of 2010, there were 48 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture was 12. Assuming ongoing historic rates of yield gain, we would have 15 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions in 2050. And at the time we wrote the report, we thought the global target for greenhouse gas emissions was 21 gigatons. It's probably now like 5 or 10. And agriculture at that 15 level, let's see, where is the pointer working? Okay. At that 15 level, agriculture by itself would be 70% of all human emissions. In fact, agriculture by itself would probably be more than all of the allowable human emissions. Now, that assumes ongoing yield gains and livestock improvements. So we did an analysis on what would happen if we tried to feed the world in 2050 with today's farms. And what you had was you would clear more than 3 billion hectares of land. There would not basically be a forest left in the temperate zone or the tropics. And you would emit, what was our number? Now I don't have the emission number here. Oh, no, that's the hectares, but you would emit something, I think it was 38 gigatons of CO2. So the point is that our analysis, as challenging as it was for 2050, assumed ongoing historic rates of yield gain and livestock improvements. They don't happen by themselves. So what is the number one obligation for agriculture? And let's say the whole food system. It is to minimize the land carbon footprint. We need to stop expanding agricultural land. We have to do that while feeding a lot more people, most of whom today eat very little meat and milk, and some of whom will eat more. I'll show you that. And that's before you get to natural climate solutions, right? Natural climate solutions are assuming we're going to reforest land. They mostly rely on reforesting large parts of the world's grazing land that was historically forested. When you look at some of those studies, they're basically assuming you take almost all the grazing land in Europe and reforest it. Now that can't happen if we need the food. So that's the challenge. It's the land use. Okay, where is the slides? It's not working. Okay. So how do you do that? So I'm not going to go through all of our different solutions, but basically they fall into what we now call produce, protect, reduce, and restore. So these were the emissions without ongoing yield gains. This was the yield gains we assumed. You're down to 15 gigatons, and then all these other things. So what does it mean? You got to produce more food on the same land. You have to do everything you can to reduce demand for land-intensive foods. You have to use that actually to protect habitat. There's a whole problem with reshifting agriculture, which causes carbon and biodiversity losses, even as we allow other areas to reforest, and that's a problem. And then we need to restore the land to nature that we can ultimately make not available or isn't really good for agriculture. Okay, so when we talk about reducing demand, above all, and this is important for soil carbon, we need to reduce beef. So beef has emissions that are overwhelmingly greater than every other food, including every other animal product. This is the production emissions, the dark, and these are what we call the land use costs, which the way to think about that, I'll come back to this later, is that's the ongoing cost of using land that could be, alternatively, if you weren't using it for agriculture, could regrow. You can think of it as kind of like a rental cost of land. Another way to think about it is, if you personally consume a kilogram of beef in a world that's expanding agricultural land, we're going to have to clear the land necessary to produce that kilogram of beef. If you divide that by about 30, you amortize that over 30 years, that's that number. So that's the land use cost, that's the production emissions. And above all, we need to produce less, consume less beef. Now, I actually spend more of my time trying to improve the productivity of beef, particularly in Latin America. So there are about 460 million hectares of land for pasture in Latin America. They're the most underutilized lands on the planet. We could generally probably produce at least half of that land. We could produce 3 times as much beef, if not 5 times per hectare. We also need to do that. So we need to both produce more beef on the same land and hold down the demand. Now, one way you hold down the demand, hopefully, we have plant-based meats. That's the Impossible Burger. In some sense, maybe the future of the planet depends on that. But this is the relentless growth in demand for meat and milk. And it's going to keep growing like that. And the reason is, I'm going to spend a little time on this graphic. We focus on trying to reduce meat consumption or milk consumption up here. We're up here. This is the per capita consumption of animal products. And this is the population of those regions in 2050. So European Union, the US, we consume in the red, that's how much milk and meat we consume per person per day. And you can see that while it's a lot, if we reduce our consumption, let's say here, this is about 50%, it's only applied to a small part of the global population. Now, in 2050, more than 6 billion people will live in these places. And today they consume on average about a quarter of the milk and meat that we do. So if they consume even half of the milk and meat that we do, we're still going to require a lot more meat and milk. So that's the point. We need to hold down demand, but we also need to increase production per hectare. Okay. So again, just logically, if you want to avoid land use change, which we have to do, all climate strategies assume we've avoided all land use change, you get at least 50% more production per hectare. And then if you want natural climate solutions, you need even more. Okay, now what's actually happening in the world? Unfortunately, what's happening in the world is we're clearing, cropland is expanding at a rate we've never seen before. This was a great study by Potapov et al. In Nature Food. Long story, first time I think satellites were able to probably do a reasonable job of tracking cropland, and basically found 10 million hectares per year expansion of cropland. And you know how big an area that is. And that was for arable crops. There's probably at least another 1 million hectares of expansion per year for perennial crops. If you could keep doing that, that means you're going to clear an area twice the size of India by 2050. Okay, now let's turn to soil carbon. So when people make big estimates of the potential for soil carbon, what are they focusing on? So this is one paper by Basio and some of our well-known friends like Pete Smith of the potential for soil carbon, huge amounts of soil carbon. But when you look at it, it turns out that almost all the big numbers come from avoided deforestation or restoration of forests or peatlands. In other words, it's about reducing the amount of land in agricultural production, not sequestering carbon on working lands. That's where the big numbers come from. To reduce the demand for agricultural land, you have to produce and protect. Produce, protect, and reduce, right? So that's the first task, even for soil carbon. Again, another paper, the rationale for the 4 per mil, the big numbers were in avoiding agricultural land, not in working agricultural land. So the second largest number that people see, and actually I think I should have put this is from another 4 per mil justification by McCasney. For that, most of it was either removing land from production or adding organic amendments like manure. So let's go back. What's the problem with relying on manure? There's only so much manure, right? I apply manure to my farm. You take it and apply it to your farm. You'll get soil carbon, but I'll lose soil carbon, right? So just moving the manure around the landscape by itself. This is critical. So organic farming, why does it gain soil carbon? Because they're using manure, not fertilizer. That will increase carbon on that farm, on that field, but it won't increase carbon overall. So another big solution people talk about is converting cropland to grassland. Again, you'll build soil carbon. What's the limiting factor? You get about 1/10 of the food for grazing land and cropland. So that's not going to happen at scale. This was a study that basically said we're going to have carbon neutral beef put out by General Mills because we're going to convert cropland to pasture. And then the carbon sequestered would offset the methane, but they're going to produce 1/10 of the food. This is a negative because you have to replace that food somewhere else. Okay. There are some studies in Europe saying we can sequester more carbon by reducing the stocking rate. We need more. Even if we hold down the consumption of beef and milk, we're going to need more beef and milk. If you reduce the stocking rate in Europe, you're going to produce more somewhere else, right? So that can't be the solution. Now, that doesn't mean we need to intensify all of our extensive grazing land. So Europe has about 20 million hectares of extensive grazing land, or 25. It's some of the most biodiverse land in Europe. We should preserve it. Why do we preserve it? We preserve it for biodiversity, and I'm going to come back to that. Biochar is interesting. There's some estimates that say, well, we can basically increase productivity and double the carbon gains from biochar in some cases. It's expensive. But again, where does the carbon come from? Well, if it comes from residues, great. But there are studies saying we should just cut down trees, turn it into biochar and apply that to the land. And then if you actually look at it, the carbon you lose from cutting down the trees offsets that benefit for 40 or 50 years. Okay. So I'm going to give you now a thought that is completely against the conventional wisdom. So can carbon farming payments actually be legitimate in the sense of, can we assure that when you pay a farmer for the amount of carbon he or she sequesters, that that's additional carbon? Okay, what about manure? So we have a situation where in field 1 applies manure, field 2 applies synthetic fertilizer. We have a carbon payment system. You can't pay the farmer on field 1 because he's already doing it. So you pay the farmer on field 2. He sequesters carbon, but it comes at the expense of the farmer on field 1. Or, okay, I'm going to forget about that. What about if you convert cropland to grassland over here? Well, then farmer 2 converts grassland to cropland. So the problem is, we do know how to sequester carbon on any individual field. You add manure, you convert cropland to pasture, but that doesn't benefit the system. It's just the individual farmer. So if you have a payment system that pays farmers for the amount of carbon they specifically sequester, which is what people are pursuing, can you have a legitimate system? I don't think so. You're almost guaranteed to be rewarding people for just moving carbon around the landscape. Now, in a way, this is good though, because it means we also have measurement problems with that. So what we have to do is reward activities that build carbon overall, right? Not that don't just move carbon around the landscape. So we need to assess what those activities are, reward those activities, but we have to be in the business of rewarding activities. Now, this is contrary to everybody's accepted wisdom that no, we're going to reward farmers specifically for the carbon they sequester. And I think that will automatically, almost inevitably lead to the fact that we have a non-legitimate system that would just be paying people for taking somebody else's carbon. Okay, same thing about integrating livestock, right? If you have 2 farms, one with livestock, one with crops, yeah, you can integrate them, but now you have 2 with livestock and crops. Is that really going to sequester more carbon overall? I'm skeptical because now you're plowing up this land, both fields occasionally. Okay. Where does the belief in massive soil carbon come from? Well, you've probably seen this. This is the famous 2007 IPCC report on carbon mitigation in agriculture. And the red is all carbon sequestration. So everyone used to go around saying 90% of the potential mitigation in agriculture was through carbon sequestration. And this is cropland, and then this is grazing land. This was repeated. The same paper was basically repeated in a Paustian et al. Study in Nature. Where do these numbers come from? I tried to look it up. There was no documentation. Now, when I say no documentation, I don't mean a little documentation. I mean no documentation. There was no publication setting forth that model at all. And what I think they ended up doing was they had some simple coefficients for no-till, applied it basically to the whole world, had huge amounts of cropland. Simple coefficients for pasture, applied it to the world, had huge carbon sequestration estimates for pasture. I actually think that's a bit of a slap in the face of the scientific community, because that went through the IPCC not once, but twice. Thousands of people reviewed that. Obviously, not one asked for the documentation. Why? Because we wanted it to be true. That's got to be the case. As scientists, that can't be what we do. But having said that, look how small all the other things were. Now, I think all the other mitigation was small because the IPCC has historically treated technology in agriculture as fixed. Now, if you look at the energy mitigation chapter, it's all about what we're going to assume about new technologies, new inventions. And they say, well, we're going to estimate that solar is going to become cheap, electric cars are going to become cheap, enormous mitigation potential as these technologies evolve. In agriculture, there was no technological assumptions of improvement. And as a result, there was no mitigation potential. But I think there is a lot of potential to innovate, which I don't really have a chance to talk through here, but that's where we need to be focusing. Okay, again, we now know with grazing systems that the potential is probably a lot harder to improve. Okay, now this is work that I've been heavily influenced in my thinking about the potential for soil carbon by John Kierkegaard from Australia. And you may have seen his papers. He did a whole bunch of papers that basically indicated what to me is intuitive after he explains it, that soil carbon depends on nitrogen, right? So soil carbon, at least MOM, is basically dead microbes. To have dead microbes, you need live microbes. To have live microbes, you need not just carbon, but nutrients. And therefore, if you want more soil carbon, you have to start with more live microbes, which means you have to start with more nutrients. So he also found that there's basically a pretty consistent 12-to-1 ratio of carbon to nitrogen around the world. And when he did experiments where he just added carbon and not nitrogen, you actually lost soil carbon. Why? Because the microbes were raiding existing carbon for the nitrogen, and then we're losing some in the process. So, and this is again, this kind of ratio between nitrogen and carbon pretty much everywhere. Again, soil carbon you gained if you had nutrients, not without nutrients. And think about this, right? So everyone wants diversified agriculture. Well, you know, this is Rwanda. You've got highly diversified agriculture in Rwanda. What you don't have is a lot of soil carbon. Why? Because in Africa, there isn't enough nutrients. They're mining nutrients from the soils. So everyone's going around doing these projects to try and add carbon to the soil in Africa and discovering they're not building soil carbon. Why? Because they're not adding nutrients, right? They're still mining nutrients. So there were, criticisms of this point saying, well, wait a second, that we have lots of, the world has surplus nitrogen. Surely we can capture that surplus nitrogen in Europe or the United States. And I think that's true. But how much? So this was a paper in, I should have had the site. Oh yeah, here it is in Nature in 2015. I was actually a kind of a junior author. And we estimated the surplus nitrogen in each region in the world. So here's the surplus nitrogen in, where do we have Europe here? Where's, I think we have Europe somewhere. Europe here, 7 million tons of nitrogen. So let's calculate how much carbon we think we can get. Okay, 4 per mil would require 6 billion tons of carbon per year. At 12-to-1, 500 million tons of nitrogen. The total global surplus of nitrogen is 100 million tons. So if you captured every single ton of that nitrogen, you get a fifth of the target of 4 per mil. Now in India and China have half the surplus, and everyone agrees the goal there should be to reduce that surplus. They apply way, way too much nitrogen. But what about Europe? 7 million tons of nitrogen can mean 84 million tons of carbon, but probably half of that surplus is lost to the air, so we can't use that. What if we capture 50% of the leached? You get 21 million tons, so 77 million tons of CO2. So that's the max. Now, should we do that? Yes. We absolutely should. And that also tells you that the things that are probably going to work best are the things that capture nitrogen, like cover crops. So I love cover crops. I've done 2 papers on cover crops, in part because I've spent a lot of my career trying to deal with nitrogen pollution, but actually that's probably great, we hope, to capture carbon. Now, we still have the question of nitrous oxide, and there's some depth issues, but I think that gives us some idea. So what else should we be looking at? Okay, we were talking about cover crops. I think actually increasing productivity in parts of the world where productivity is low is a really great way to sequester carbon. Now, better grazing, hopefully is the case. Why? Because you're increasing productivity, although the results are a little bit modest. I don't know what we can do in Europe, but we can do a lot of that in Latin America. Now, in Latin America, this is on a very small amount of grazing land, but it's these intensive silvopastoral systems. I work on those. Yeah, that will work technically. We can sequester carbon in soils. We can sequester carbon above ground. The biggest benefit is you can produce 5 times the amount of cattle per hectare. So you don't need to expand cattle as much. Okay, what about agroforestry? Everyone wants to talk about agroforestry. Well, first of all, most agroforestry in the world is this: coffee, rubber, cocoa, willows, and oil palm. I'll come back to oil palm. Well, most people aren't that thrilled about having more coffee, rubber, cocoa, or willows now are being talked about, right, for energy crops. Here's the problem with all of these. They don't replace annual crops. So yeah, you can have more of these, but we still need the food. So what are the 2 conditions to get a benefit from a perennial crop? It first has to replace an annual crop. And second, it has to do it on existing agricultural land. So what's the biggest example of agroforestry that does replace an annual crop? It's oil palm. And oil palm, the problem with oil palm is it doesn't grow in Europe. It grows really well in tropical forests in Indonesia. So we should be pursuing those. Now, I'm actually kind of obsessed with this tree called Pangamia, which is an Asian tree that produces essentially a pod that's almost the same as a soybean. So farmers, a company trying this in Florida, it basically produces both an oil seed, both a protein feed and vegetable oil. And this could, in theory, replace soybeans. And this is the key point. We're going to need innovative farming systems to make this happen, not just say more. There was a paper put out claiming we could basically solve emissions problems in Europe through agroforestry. It was almost entirely based, when you looked at the underlying studies, of having more willow. Which, yeah, you could replace food production in Europe with willow. That's a great idea. Okay, what about grasses? So I'm enthusiastic in Denmark. They're trying a system where you take high protein grasses, you press them, you end up with more digestible grass for cattle, and 20% might be a protein feed for pigs. Yeah, we should pursue that. In fact, I personally think we should be doing a lot of research into ways of taking grasses and making them more digestible. And we actually can, right? There are methods using pressure and heat that could, or even enzymatic cellulose, enzymes for cellulosic ethanol that could basically turn grasses into highly digestible feeds. Now, if we can learn how to do that, we can have grasses replace grains. But that's the kind of thing we're going to have to be looking at if we really want to turn to perennial systems. Okay, so this is kind of the summary of what I've said so far. And I'll just leave it that to look at that. Okay, now we're going on to my favorite topic. Why were these mistakes made? Like, oh yeah, it's a really great idea to kind of turn our cropland into grassland. It's because people have treated land as free. That it's not from a carbon standpoint, that using land is not a carbon cost. Now, this is a map with an estimate of the carbon uptake of native vegetation, NPP of original native vegetation. And what you see is there's only so much land in the world that takes up has a bunch of productivity, right? That's what we got. We have not improved on that as a whole. We've actually reduced the amount of plant growth. This is where we can grow plants well. That's it. And all of it's valuable, either for food production or to store carbon from a climate change perspective. Every hectare matters. So how should we assign a charge to that? A cost. If you use land, that's a cost. Well, if any of you have taken any economics, but this is an intuitive idea, we know what a perfect, efficient way of allocating resources would be to deal with climate change. We can't do it practically, we can't do it politically, but theoretically, we know what you do. You assign a carbon price to everything. And it's the same carbon price. So if you had a perfect carbon system, you would charge the coal-fired power plant, let's say $100 a ton for every ton of carbon emitted. You charge everyone who cleared a forest $100 a ton for every ton emitted, and everyone who planted a forest would be paid $100 a ton. Now, we can't do it, but we know that if we are doing things like that, we are achieving an efficient allocation of land and efficient allocation of resources. So our rules have to imitate that. We have to try to have rules for doing climate accounting that assign the same value. Now, what would that mean? It's something called the opportunity cost. If you're using a hectare of land, the cost is not using it for something else. So the minimum cost could be how much carbon you could store on that land if you let it reforest or regrow. Or, and this could be even higher, it's the amount of carbon you could store on other land if you continue to use that land to produce food. Because that's what would happen. Think what would happen if we had this system. It would be extremely expensive to clear land. It would be very valuable to take not so good land and reforest it. We'd be paying people not to use land for agriculture, and therefore to meet food supplies, we would have to intensify production on existing land to meet food needs. So we'd be essentially rewarding people by paying higher prices to produce more food on the same land, and we'd reward people or we penalize people for clearing land, and we'd reward people for reforesting. We'd be assigning a value to each hectare of land. If nothing else, let's say you could sequester 3 tons of carbon or 11 tons of CO2 per hectare at $100 per ton, we'd be paying people $1,100 per hectare per year just to reforest. And that means bad land for beef production would be reforested. People would consume less beef, but people on good land for beef production would use it better. So we have to imitate those rules. Now, that's what it would mean. I've just gone through that. One of the things means that bioenergy would be really expensive, right? Because the alternative to using land for bioenergy would be, you might be paid $100 a ton to reforest that land, or you'd be paid a lot more money for your food production on that land. So you wouldn't need to have any other strategy. It would just be automatically the price, the cost of land would be passed on to the decision how to use it. Well, I happen to have a paper that gives you a system for actually doing that. It's actually quite simple. We look at the average carbon cost of producing each type of food in the world. We have a typical cost. If you increase your production of that, that's a benefit by that amount of carbon. If you reduce your production of food, that's a cost. So I encourage you to look at that. But now let me think about it for bioenergy. And I'm going to talking about bioenergy because it's very relevant to European policy today. So the benefit of bioenergy is that you use land to produce plants to replace fossil fuels. The cost is not using that land for another purpose. The typical estimate of bioenergy in Europe assigns 0 cost to that. Not a little, 0. Now, let me show you here is the cost. Let's say, so a typical hectare of bioenergy today, best case estimate, not counting a land use cost, might be 1.5 tons of carbon per hectare per year. That's at really high yields. If you allow that land to regrow as forest, it's 3 tons. So you wouldn't do it. But actually, it's even worse than that. So this is the efficiency of converting solar energy into usable energy through bioenergy. Now, for corn ethanol, it's 13 watts out of every 1,000 watts of solar energy. For biodiesel, it's even lower. For Brazilian sugarcane, it's 20 out of 1,000. Cellulosic ethanol, best case in the whole United States estimated, maybe in the future, if it ever happens, 35 out of 1,000. And solar cells, this was even before, are 150 out of 1,000. When you then use that energy in an electric car, you get another 3 times benefit because an electric car is 3 times more efficient than an internal combustion car. So for the same hectare of land, if you were to put solar cells even on the best farmland and use them in an electric car, you'll go 300 miles, 300 kilometers for every 1 kilometer from biofuels. And this is a calculation that shows that in that Nature paper I mentioned. So who would ever think of using bioenergy? And the answer is, if you treat land as free. So I'm running out of time, but let me go through this a little bit. So Europe's Fit for 55 plan, okay, I'm almost done. Europe's Fit for 55 plan is based on using European land for bioenergy. So I did an estimate and discovered, so this was a paper in Nature in December, that Europe already basically outsources about 20% of its food production based on the land use cost. It's about, the net is about 400 million tons of CO2 per year. That's in effect how much carbon cost there is per year to the fact that Europe already imports food. So what's the Fit for 55 plan according to its own mind? And that's what you import. I'm skipping faster. What's the plan? The plan is to take 20% of Europe's cropland and turn it into energy crops. Why? Because bioenergy is viewed as free. You don't have a land use cost in any of the laws. That's the modeling of the European Commission. Europe, which already outsources its food production, this climate strategy is to outsource more. It also contemplates in the modeling converting half of those semi-natural grasslands. Remember I said I'd come back to that? That's on top of this. That's in the modeling of the European Commission for the Fit for 55 plan that passed. The reason for this is we have climate accounting that treats land as free. So I just want to mention that there are ways, additional ways to address climate change. These are 3 long reports I've written talking about additional measures. I'm not going to go through those today, but I think the basic conceptual way to think of it is, just like in the energy sector, we need to be innovative in the agricultural sector and develop new technologies. And let me just summarize again what I think are the kind of the key points. The biggest effort for soil carbon is like everything else, hold down the amount of agricultural land. So don't do things that increase the demand, like increasing demand for beef or reduced output per hectare. I think nitrogen is just imposes a real limit on how much carbon we're going to sequester. Again, this key point, a carbon rewarding technique to farmers has to reward activities, not quantities, because of that additionality problem. And then lastly, and this is most important for you all, and I didn't have time to really go through the technique, but when you evaluate the climate change effect of different farming practices, you need to build in the opportunity cost of land. And that means those techniques that increase carbon or increase output per hectare get a double benefit. So someone was telling me yesterday, oh, there's some new science that maybe in Europe, deepening the root system will actually be better for yields because it can access more water, that now we should be focusing on that. So maybe you can sequester carbon and boost yields. That gets double rewarded for both the yield gain and the carbon gain. But if you're reducing food production, that should get a penalty. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much.